Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. Africa is the region that is growing fastest out of the global recession. This according to a report by the African Development Bank. I am joined today by Engineering News Senior Contributing Editor Keith Campbell, who attended the launch of the Economic Outlook report. Keith, welcome to Second Take. What is the African Development Bank's prediction for growth, and also what is driving the expansion?
Well, their prediction for growth for the whole continent for this year is 4.5%, followed by 5.5% next year and growth of 6% in 2012. The main single factor driving the growth is China, the booming Chinese market, but it's not the only factor. Other major emerging market economies are becoming increasingly significant for the continent, both as markets and as sources of investment. China is the very big story at the moment. Chinese demand for African minerals, metals, and other output is the single biggest factor driving economic growth at the moment. But other players are coming into the scene. India, Brazil, significant with regard to these Portuguese-speaking countries. Even Turkey apparently is becoming a significant feature in the economics of East Africa, particularly Ethiopia.
What region of Africa is doing the best?
It's actually East Africa. The African Development Bank highlights very good macroeconomic management in Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda. There's significant economic growth underway in Ethiopia, which now has a population of something like 85 million people. So East Africa is doing the best. The region that's doing the worst, I'm afraid to say, is Southern Africa. Indeed, of the 10 African countries that had economic contraction last year, 6 of them were in Southern Africa, and including South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Angola, Swaziland, and I'm counting Madagascar as being in Southern Africa as well.
What are the risk factors to Africa's growth?
Well, the number one risk factor is a slowdown in global economic recovery. The possibility of major problems in Europe disrupting the global economy, that is the biggest single factor. But there are others, for example, political instability, which is still apparent in a number of countries. There is also the issue of overdependence on specific exports. The African Development Bank has highlighted that African countries have made quite significant progress in diversifying their economies. For example, agriculture now accounts for a bigger proportion of Nigeria's gross domestic product than oil does. But there is still an awful long way to go, and there's a risk that the current boom in minerals and metals and petrochemicals, hydrocarbons, could cause African countries to falter in their diversification efforts. And of course, if you're excessively dependent on one or two products, then you become very vulnerable to market volatility. So that's another notable risk factor.
The African Development Bank also highlighted the need for foreign investment to tackle the continent's infrastructure deficit. Can you talk about that?
Well, the African Development Bank estimates the continent's infrastructure deficit at $1.5 trillion US. And there's basically no way that Africa can fund this from its own resources. So foreign investment is needed. Currently, foreign aid to Africa is running at $100 million a year. By the way, there's no sign of that being cut yet, although we could see reductions in the next couple of years as a number of major donor countries begin to cut government spending at home very significantly. It's very difficult to justify giving foreign aid when you are cutting domestic services significantly. But on the other hand, a cut in foreign aid may not necessarily be a bad thing for Africa, given the state of the overall economic situation at the moment. But there's no doubt that to overcome the infrastructure deficit, there's going to be a need for foreign investment. They're going to have to find a way of attracting private sector investment into infrastructure in Africa. The infrastructure deficit, of course, varies enormously from country to country and region to region. Some parts of Africa have pretty good infrastructure. Southern Africa, North Africa, and within those regions, of course, you have South Africa and Egypt with quite considerable and world-class infrastructure. But even South Africa and Egypt need more infrastructure in the view of the African Development Bank, and the other parts of Africa need dramatically more infrastructure. There are not enough railways. There are not enough efficient ports. There's not enough intra-African air travel. To get from one country to another country in Africa, you still often have to fly via Europe or the Middle East. And roads, only about a third of African roads are paved. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. And then we've got to add electricity generation and things like affordable housing, not only for the poor, but also for the lower middle classes in much of Africa.
Keith, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us on the show. That is the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.